Welcome back to another episode of Chalk Talk. We are going to kick off another EDU style episode with Coach Bres. We've dove into a lot of different topics, but today we're going to talk about one of those questions we see a lot from students, athletes, and coaches alike all over social media and with our own students and athletes we work with, and that is the trap bar deadlift question and the trap bar versus conventional deadlift question. So we're excited to kick this one off. Remember, check out our full library of podcasts wherever you listen to them, be it Spotify, Apple, on our website, wherever you go, check out our full library. We'll go ahead and kick this one off, which is sure to be a great episode. This is Chalk Talk, presented by Platform. Let's go. All right, like I said, we are kicking another EDU-style episode off with Coach Bres. Thanks for joining us. We're excited to be talking about trap bar versus what we're calling conventional deadlifts. We'll define both of them like we always do, and then kind of dive into the nuts and bolts. Obviously, this is one that, like I mentioned at the front end of the show, is something we've heard a lot about in the last couple of months, but it's something I even heard from students and athletes alike, because at the gym that a lot of my kids go to, there's both, and they're staring down the barrel of which one am I supposed to be doing, which one's better for me, is one going to make me stronger, X, Y, and Z. So as most conversations that we kick off here, it's not totally black and white, but let's just kind of dive in. We'll go into both variations, we'll define both, and then talk about kind of the logistics of why or why not you would do one.
Sure. I think it's a good one. We actually just had a couple questions come in via email about this exact topic. And, you know, funnily enough, if you're at all familiar with Strength Coach Twitter or, you know, fitness Twitter in general, it was a debate that raged pretty hotly for a week or two just recently. So it's always been on our list of topics to cover. And it's a question we've been asked a lot over the years, and so I think it's finally time to sit down and try to do the debate and conversation justice. And as you said, I think what's really important is this is a really interesting conversation to have, and there is no even right or wrong side of this. It's just a good thing to be educated on so that you understand all the tools at your disposal as an athlete, as a coach, and just knowing what, why, when, etc. is well worth it.
Absolutely. So probably you're going to get into more detail about the trap bar variation of the deadlift, but let's take maybe one step back before we do any of that and just talk about a deadlift in general, so we're all on the same page of what that is.
Sure.
And then we'll dive into actually what it is we're set out to do.
Yeah, without trying to, you know, really backpedal all the way back in history and start from the beginning. I think we're all pretty familiar with a conventional barbell deadlift. It's one of the competition lifts seen in powerlifting. More specifically, though, we're really talking about the clean deadlift, the double overhand, hands outside of the legs, lift from the ground, a dead weight position on the ground to the hips with a standard barbell. And, you know, I think most people recognize the deadlift. I think also most people understand that it is widely considered one of the biggest, best bang for buck strength, full body strength and stability development exercises that there is. And as we get into the kind of evolution of the trap bar versus barbell variation debate or conversation, understand that I think even those that maybe, you know, drive the conversation towards trap bar or away from conventional, I don't know that anybody would disagree, however, that the deadlift, one as a movement, and the conventional barbell deadlift is still one of the best exercises that really just about anybody can do for almost any reason.
Yep, for sure. Awesome, and I think that's a good kind of elevator pitch of the deadlift in general. Let's dive into what the trap bar is. Other people call it a hex bar even.
Yeah.
There's different names for it, but you know, it's that bar that you kind of step inside of, and it is kind of and why we call it hex, kind of the way that the shape forms around you.
Right.
And then the weights kind of go on either side. So it's not like a long straight barbell, but something you step into and has handles that you then grab to deadlift.
Correct, and I think you absolutely nailed the depiction of what the hex bar trap bar deadlift looks like. We've moved the load from in front of our body with a barbell to our sides via those handles, and we've stepped into the instrument rather than having it in front of us. So it's instead of that anterior load of a barbell deadlift, we've kind of shifted everything back, which we'll talk about a little bit later, also means that we've changed a bit of hip angle and torso angle, etc. But just worth noting, because it kind of influences the wide deadlift, wide trap bar, differences between the two considerations. The reason it exists was because there was a power lifter back in the 80s that Al Gerard, I believe his name was, Al Gerard. He had injured his back and was looking to still train for a competition, and deadlift, as we said, was one of his competition lifts. So he wanted to train the movement without exacerbating the back issue, and so he literally created this instrument for himself, so that it would allow him to train a relatively hip hinge pattern that was similar to the barbell deadlift without really causing any of the discomfort that he had through the back injury. And he found that it was both wildly successful in improving his actual deadlift. He set PRs down the road after not having barbell deadlifted, and also avoiding any sort of re-injury of the back area. So it is the reason that it exists, and also the reason that a lot of people like the trap bar deadlift, in that it is very similar to a barbell deadlift in terms of mechanics and muscles worked and everything else. And there's a case to be made for less stress on the low back in particular, and you're basically the shearing force on your spine. So that's why it was created, and it's also why many people have adopted it to this day, to use it with athletics or general population, or really anybody that's not competing in the barbell deadlift as a competition movement.
Sure, and I think we'll get into it because, like you mentioned, there are both similarities and differences to those like movements, and you said it kind of a few times in terms of some of like the shearing force and not being as strenuous on certain muscles. It like you said, even just in your original description, one's out in front of you in a conventional deadlift. Now it's loaded to your sides, and there are a lot of different things, but you mentioned kind of once or twice in that description that it maybe is a little bit safer, and I think sometimes that's what people like hear and the bells start ringing, and that's why they go to that one no matter what. So let's talk a little bit about some of the similarities, knowing like why people could do maybe either of them, and then some of the differences, and maybe start to, again, like I just mentioned, the triggers of like, well, that's why I would do this one or that one.
Yes, and I think important to note is that there are probably far more similarities between the two movements than there are differences. So though we will talk about the differences and considerations of the what and why and when of using either, note that at that point we're probably comparing degrees within the 5 and 10% difference, not something that's wildly different. I think one of the the pitfalls that we fall into in this discussion is that we're kind of putting them on two very opposite sides of the field, as if they are movements that are has to be one or the other, or are wildly different. And for the most part, the trap bar deadlift and the barbell deadlift are more similar than they're different.
Yep.
They both essentially train a hip hinge pattern. We'll talk about how there is slight degrees of difference there. One being a bit more, closer to a squat, one more closer to a pure hip hinge, etc. But you are picking heavy weight off the floor, and you're going to train, for the most part, the same basic musculature in both movements. And as I mentioned, because of a slight difference in mechanics, you're going to have a slightly different level of engagement. Basically, think it posterior chain to anterior, hamstring versus quads, etc. So it is very much the case that you could never barbell deadlift and only trap bar and get more or less what you had hoped to get out of a deadlift. It's also okay to have never trap bar deadlift and only barbell deadlift. You're not missing something major, because they very much do overlap more than they are, separate or different from one another.
Right. Not to jump ahead and put the cart before the horse, but sometimes the question's like, well, should I go out and get trap bars? Or, well, I have trap bars, so I want to use them. And I think people get caught up because they think that they're going to gain or lose one thing or another. Good to hear from the forefront, especially as people are listening to this, that like there are a lot of similarities. Like you said, we're both still have deadlift in the name, and we're still, hinging to a degree and picking something up off the floor, which is, like we've talked about in a lot of different episodes, kind of a foundational movement of life, not even just for athletics in that way. So let's get into the differences, though, because there are, as you've mentioned now a few times, angle differences, level of hinge differences. Sometimes, it's a little bit more squatty with maybe a trap bar deadlift versus a little bit more of that true hinge pattern with a conventional deadlift. I don't know how we can kind of jump from one thing to the other, but I'm sure you have a way of thinking about some of those key differences.
Yeah, I think hitting the difference is important. We'll just try to knock them off one by one. There aren't so many that we can't get through it pretty quickly. The first, as I mentioned before, though, thing to note is that we're talking a very small matter of degree when we're talking difference, but the differences are important. To know the difference is important because they will serve different purposes in slight different degrees. But the first is loading. So I think anybody that's done both movements knows that comparably, you can almost always, about 10% greater, lift more with a trap bar deadlift than you can a conventional barbell deadlift. Now, there are considerations as to why that's a good or bad thing on either end, right?
Yeah.
More weight means greater strength and power stimulus. More weight means, and this is I'm speaking to the audience that we primarily work with, is younger athletes and more weight isn't always necessarily the best thing. When you're training LeBron James and it's, hey, we just need the most output, great, let's maybe use the trap bar because maybe we want to just generate the most adaptation. But when we're talking about youth athletes that are learning a lot of different movement patterns, maybe it's, well, we don't really care about mobility and force limitations. We want to stay within a movement pattern specifically, like the hinge. We don't need to load it up like crazy because we're also just then risking poor movement.
Yeah, and I think that's where, as a coach myself, when I've gotten the question came from, I've been doing trap bar deadlift and I went to do a conventional deadlift because it was in a program or whatever else, and I lifted less. Am I doing something wrong?
Right.
So it becomes this kind of like, lost in translation between the two. And additionally to that, like we've always talked about and ad nauseum, there's that natural, especially in certain groups of kids, to chase the weight, and the trap bar deadlift lets you do that, kind of chase a certain weight. And that's, I think, an important distinction to at least be mindful of, is that your body can probably handle, like you said, a higher load in that. And just because you can do that, because the movement pattern doesn't mean you necessarily should until you've kind of like locked down the mechanics,
right?
Like in any other movement.
Well, and to be fair, it's very similar to the barbell deadlift in that same regard, because often when we're operating at the maximum output on either of those movements, most kids don't have the best adherence to really solid mechanics. So as long as you're focused on it, one's not inherently worse. But anytime you add the statement of we can load this more, it just has to come with the understanding and caveat of, well, only if and only if we are really hyper-focused on how we move.
Yeah, and maybe you'll get to this, but it always then becomes the question, for me at least, of like, well, what is the reason why that number is higher for a trap bar? If all things are, equal otherwise, like you take an athlete that moves well, knows the form of both, but the trap bar deadlift is higher. Is it because of the way the weight's positioned?
Right.
Is it the way that...
And that's exactly it. And that's the next big difference is because the load has moved from in front of the shins to the sides, you're now operating in the center of gravity. So it's almost a blend of a squat and a deadlift. And I want to be clear, a lot of people say, you know, squatty deadlift or a hingey squat. Both movements are far closer to hinge than they are squat.
Yeah.
But neither of them are pure hip hinges, right? An RDL is a pure hip hinge. A good morning is a pure hip hinge.
Right.
A conventional deadlift, closer to those.
But as you press the floor away for either...
You're still bending the knee, right? It's not major in a conventional. It's more so happening in a trap bar deadlift, but neither of them are anywhere near, obviously, doing a proper full depth range of motion squat.
Yep. But I think that just alone, what you said at the very beginning, just to like highlight it, of where the weight is and thinking about, you know, anything out in front of you is naturally going to take a few more moving parts than if it's in your center of gravity. In terms of, even for a kid, at least, you know, to take that back to the kids I talk to would help a lot to understand, like, look at where the weight is. Right. And look at where your center of gravity is and all of those different types of things. I think that alone helps in that distinction between the two.
Right, exactly. And then because of how that movement works and where the load is, there is a slight difference in activation and obviously engagement and development of certain, you know, prime movers. Your hamstrings and lower back, the erectors, are gonna get more from a conventional barbell deadlift than a trap bar. Yep. And then the flip side is true. The trap bar deadlift is going to be more quad driven. Again, we're talking degrees, small degrees, but a call it statistically significant difference. It's not night and day. It's not you're only training quads or hamstrings, but enough so that many coaches would say if you're trap bar deadlifting instead of conventional, you should or absolutely must also be doing a good degree of pure hip hinge for the development of hamstrings and lower back, because the conventional barbell deadlift is so epically great for that. The trap bar isn't quite as. But again, that's not the be-all, end-all. You don't have to get it that way. So there is a difference between the movements. You don't have to pigeonhole them into squat and hinge. They're both more generally hinge, but with, you know, some squat, you know, obviously elements to each of them. It's just that the trap bar is kind of a little further down the line on that hinge squat continuum.
Yep, that makes total sense. So with that being said, I think a good outline and just understanding of kind of the both key distinctions, but also, like you said, they're pretty close in a lot of ways. But I think there are still coaches that find themselves, as we talked about at the beginning, that love one or find themselves in the camp of one versus the other. I'll just have you kind of play both sides, put your you know, trap bar deadlift hat on. Like, why is that the one to love, or why do you love that one in a program or anything else like that? I'm not saying you personally, but what's the case that people who use that one typically find themselves, you know, singing its praises?
Yeah, and I think before I even do that, I think what you said is important. There are reasons to love both of them, not reasons to love one and dislike the other. So from the trap bar deadlift, I think one of the big things that a lot of people say is that the trap bar deadlift is easier to learn than the conventional barbell deadlift. Now, I will say that personally, I don't do a lot of trap bar work, not against the movement, just the places I've been don't have access to large numbers of them at once, which is going to be a point that we bring up later. So I can't speak to that from personal experience. I can only say that the conventional deadlift or any hip hinge weighted load hinge movement is always difficult to teach. I'm not convinced that just moving the load to the sides, it might make it easier to move the weight. I don't know that it is easier to teach the movement. It might be, call it, safer if you load it right away because it's harder to mess up, but I don't know that you're learning the hip hinge quicker or easier. That's what many people say though, so I mean, I'll take that certainly as one of the reasons.
For sure.
I do love, however, anything neutral grip. So neutral grip is basically, think palms facing your body when hanging at your sides. I love that pressing. I love that pulling. It's not often found in the gym because of needing different grips. Like a pull-up bar is always pronated or supinated, and a neutral grip is that hammer grip, chin up. Like those things are, I think anything neutral grip is great because it's probably our most natural mode, just as human beings, and then also in everything performance-wise. So I do love the neutral grip. I think that's great. You also can get a lot heavier without needing to do the alternating grip of deadlift, which I even do myself. I think also one of the benefits is many of trap bars have multi-level handles, which has a positive and a negative. The positive is the higher handles allow somebody to perform a good, again, loaded deadlift with maybe a slightly lesser requirement for range of motion, aka like mobility to get into that pattern all the way to the floor. As many people know that, any deadlift, height, ankle mobility, hip mobility tends to limit newer athletes, especially boys going through puberty, in my personal experience, their ability to set up well for a proper deadlift of any kind from the floor. So a high handle actually limits the range of motion and how far down you have to set up. So that's obviously something that could be a positive, although to be fair, you can just elevate a normal deadlift by raising blocks or weights or whatever underneath. And then, so there's likely less loss of a neutral spine or the chance thereof, just because there is less spinal loading, because it is a more vertical torso basically deadlift than a conventional. Now, again, I think before we all jump so far down the well, that's inherently safer, so I just want to load up a deadlift. A squat is a vertical torso, and I've seen a lot of poor spinal alignment squats. I think there is no one position that's going to be inherently really great. It's more going to be, there are positions your body is strong in, and can you maintain those under load, and are you going to stop yourself from overreaching in load in a position that is unsafe? And then I think one thing worth noting is that because you can load the trap bar deadlift heavier, there are a number of studies, although not dozens, that would suggest that you can actually get higher peak power and peak velocity through loaded trap bar deadlifts than the conventional. Again, we're talking degrees here. You can still get a lot from both. But this is what has driven a lot of the athletic world to adopt the trap bar deadlift as hey, if we can get slightly more peak power, peak velocity out of the trap bar, then why bother with the conventional deadlift? Because it's also difficult to teach, so why bother? So I understand that. I hear that, and there's a reason a lot of people do that. My only statement would be, well, kind of to some degree, peak velocity, though, can only happen if you're moving lighter weight relative to your max anyway. And you can do that with, dumbbell jumps are basically the same thing as a trap bar jump, which I love both. But you can only load that to some degree. So the idea that you can do it at higher levels with a trap bar, I guess I don't necessarily see. I think you can move a slightly higher weight at a slightly faster degree because your max is higher in a trap bar deadlift. But again, we're talking a 10% in total weight difference. So I think the difference is there, but I don't know that it is so statistically impressive that you should absolutely shift from one to the other.
Sure. Awesome. And I think that's a good overview of a trap bar deadlift and some of the reasons to love it, especially like you said, for someone who doesn't get to use it a lot. You still make some good cases and wore the hat well. Let's transition over to the more conventional deadlift. I think we've already touched on a lot of them, so we don't have to speak ad nauseum at all of these, but there are a few I want to focus in on that you have kind of jotted down here. You've mentioned it's closer to the hinge, that squat hinge continuum. Do you want to talk about that one? And then maybe paying particular notice to kind of like transition into some other movements that we work on, clean and otherwise. I think that's kind of the focus here.
Yeah, I think the one thing that most people put out there is that it is closer to the pure hip hinge, which is important. Look, I mean, everybody basically knows, acknowledges, or states that most athletes, let alone youth athletes, are woefully inadequately developed in the posterior chain. So if you can even just shift your attention slightly towards the backside of an athlete, I think that's worth it. So if you're going to gain more or less the same, but you're going to gain it in the area that you want more, conventional barbell deadlift is a great way to go. Now, to be fair, you could do the trap bar deadlift with, a lot of good RDL work and maybe get the same result, right? But that is one of the reasons people love it. And then I think, as you mentioned, another huge piece, and this cannot be overstated, if we're talking matters of degree when it comes to force, velocity, strength, etc., and we're working with youth athletes, and matter of degree, to be honest with you, doesn't matter, in my opinion. If you're talking about high school kids from freshman through senior, I don't really care about the extra couple percent. What I do care about is maximum efficiency in the total development over the course of years. And when we add in that consideration, I think that there are some call it physiological reasons that a conventional barbell deadlift can be a great option to use as the cornerstone in your, call it, hinge development, your posterior chain strength development. And one of them is, well, are you going to do anything with the Oli lifts, call it snatch or clean? Because if you are, you're gonna have to teach a pull from the floor with a conventional barbell with an double overhand grip anyway. And in my experience, the more overlap there is, the better results you're going to get, because kids are only going to remember so much. You only have so many reps. So if working one movement inherently helps the movement you're going to do the next day or the next week, I think there's a lot of benefit to that. Now, I'm not saying that trap bar doesn't have, obviously a lot of mechanically similar demand, but it's not the same. I'm not holding it here. It's not this instrument, and it's not in front of me. It's not exactly the same. And if, again, the degrees of change are only very small, I tend to think that if you can carry movement mechanics and just habit over, that can be very, very useful. And then similarly, the bar itself, and this can't be understated. I think people dismiss this argument out of hand, saying, well, why don't you just buy hex bars? Well, so coming from a place where every couple of years, maybe we get a grand or two to replace, furnish, fix, or whatever the weight room that we're in. If my choice is between 8 barbells and 8 hex bars, I think I would almost always pick 8 barbells, not because I would love to use trap bar on a regular basis. However, they're more expensive. They also have just less variability. I can bench press, I can overhead press, I can back squat, I can RDL, I can do everything with a barbell. Hex bar has some variability in it. You can do loaded jumps, you can do trap bar deadlift, you can change the angle of that deadlift to make it more squatty or more hingy, sure. You can stagger your stance. However, you can't take that hex bar and do like a close grip bench press.
Right.
And when you only have so many dollars, it does kind of become a consideration is, what can I do with this piece of equipment? The trap bar deadlift, maybe I get 5% greater output over the course of an athlete's career versus a conventional deadlift. Okay, but I can't afford to only focus on the deadlift. So I think that's a really, really big piece. And I think there's some other smaller pieces that go into the bar conversation, which is the handles. There's just one small unique kind of conversation piece, which is for some athletes don't fit in it. Now, to be fair, some athletes have a hard time with the conventional barbell deadlift because they also don't fit, right? Because they're just bigger, taller people. But the handles are set, so you can't widen your grip. And some hex bars don't have high handles. If you don't have high handles, the weight is very difficult to balance. the heavier you get. And then secondly, if you do have high handles, it's easier to balance. However, now you've shortened the range of motion even more. Now you're talking probably closer, it's not analogous, but closer to the discussion of the partial range of motion squats versus full range of motion squats.
Yep.
Both are great. But the what, when, why, how becomes a concern, like a consideration you actually have to make.
Yep, for sure.
So I think, it really does have a logistics and efficiency element to the discussion when we're talking with the people that we're talking with. And it goes beyond more than just, is this movement good?
Yeah. And I think, like you said, and this is probably where we can steer towards the end of the conversation, like, if you have them, awesome. There's merits to them. There's benefits to them. It's not like you have to let them collect dust in the corner. But I like to kind of circle back to certain platform programs myself and run through them. And in the 3-day off-season program, there's a really nice transition from doing deadlifts and hang cleans and, bridging that gap between those two movements. If I swapped out to a trap bar deadlift and went right to the cleans, when I get to the cleans, or vice versa, I know the cleans are first, but that grip is the first time I'm doing that movement.
Right.
And it feels weird. So I think, like you said, developing some of those like pulling from the ground movements that we're going to be doing as a coach, if you want to at some point work the hang clean, even the full clean, a hang snatch, a full snatch, like you have to deadlift it from the ground at some point when the weight's in front of you, not to your side. So I think that alone is a really solid point. Even when you have trap bar deadlifts, it seems like there's a case for working both of them in. So we always kind of go bottom line at the end and talk about what we should use or what makes the most sense. I think we've done a good job throughout this entire episode talking about why you can really think about doing both if you have both, but also not being totally probably panicked if you don't have a trap bar, you can't afford them.
Either, both, or really whichever you choose is totally fine, because both movements are great. Both movements drive adaptation that is useful for life or performance, and neither one is bad. They're both great. So if you have so let me be clear, for anybody that's a platform user, we don't program trap bar deadlift. Has nothing to do with even my personal preference on trap bar. It's just that I know that most high schools have barbells. Not most high schools have a large number of hex bars at the same time.
Yep.
So if that's your context, well, then we're going to stick with the conventional barbell deadlift, because forcing the issue to incorporate trap bar isn't necessary. If you have trap bars, you can make that your deadlift. If you have trap bars, you can do both. If you have trap bars, you can choose trap bars for other things like loaded plyometrics. It's a really, really useful tool. It can be a complete substitution or an addition to any program. And to your point, if you're somebody that says, hey, we do love the Oli lifts, well, then maybe conventional barbell deadlift is one of maybe a good reason to use that as your primary pull from the floor, because it obviously translates to a lot of other things you're going to do. But maybe you're somebody that says, well, I'm only ever going to hang power clean, and I am going to only ever do loaded jumps instead of a full clean from the floor. Okay, well, then maybe trap bar is the deadlift for you, because that's going to translate to your loaded jumps more than a conventional barbell deadlift. And you don't need it if all you're going to do is hang power clean, because if you're also trap bar deadlifting, you should do a lot of RDLs. RDLs, close to that nice hinge of the hang power clean. You're going to, really match those patterns really well. So either one is great.
Yeah, and like you said, I think both lend themselves to developing the hinge. And as you mentioned, and we talk about a lot, probably one of the more underdeveloped movement patterns for most kids.
Right.
So one way or another, again, and all of these we're all hoping to do this in the essence of safety and moving correctly, not just adding weight. And that goes for any type of deadlift, any type of movement, then you're getting benefits from both. And it's just about, I think sometimes too, the bigger picture of, you've mentioned probably of, all right, well, you're doing the sumo trap bar deadlift, but we're combining it with an RDL or a dumbbell RDL or these other types of hinges, a good morning, whatever it may be. It's kind of like the bigger picture, not just do you trap bar deadlift or conventional bar deadlift.
It's context, right? Like they're both awesome movements, but you can't just think of them in a silo. It's not one or the other. It's not I am this or I am that. It's I do this for this reason amongst all of these other things that I do.
Yep.
And I love them both. I mean, the deadlift reigns supreme in a lot of ways for a lot of people. I don't think you can say that one is good, one is bad, although some people do. I think they're both awesome. Why you pick it, how you pick it is really up to you, and both can be used really, really well.
Yep, for sure. And I think a good place to stop, I think this is a cool one because everybody's going to find themselves in a different situation here. Some people might have been thinking about buying them. Other people might just have them and think about using them, or somewhere in between. We know that, the context for each school might be a little bit different. So hopefully this helps kind of illuminate the larger question at hand. If you have more in-depth questions about deadlifting in general, or kind of when or how to use some of these things, come check out Platform or talk to us. We have a lot of thought out, well-detailed answers, not just in the forms of podcasts that we can kind of shoot you in the right direction of resources. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thanks again for tuning in. And as always, it's in pursuit of better.